Good morning, everyone. I hope we are all well rested. Today is a beautiful day compared to yesterday. It's something to feel good about. Yeah, hello. Yeah, something to feel good about. And no, it's on. Hello. No, it's on. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, so I think after yesterday, wet, rainy, and cold day, it's a much better day. Although I think where we are, does not make much of a difference. So again, I hope you have all read the case study for today. But before we start on that, essentially going over the past 2 days, what has been the theme of the past 2 days? On Monday, we basically talked about taking Jakarta as an example, the case of strategic planning, need for prioritization, need for focus, need to define what are short-term goals, long-term goals, need for alternative analysis. On second day, OP talked about Delhi Airport Express, and essentially the theme there was market segmentation. How do you determine the viability of a project? How do you determine the viability of the project? And how do you determine, what role does the market segmentation have to play in making the project feasible, viable, or not viable? An important part of that discussion also was the role of the private sector, but that was not the theme which was talked about yesterday. That's what we talk about today in the context of a bus terminal. So today we talk about the relative merits of PPP, the circumstances in which PPP may be a viable option, what makes it a good alternative. Before we start with the example of today, with the discussion on today's case study, what do you think is it? Why is the public sector keen about the PPP? Can I get some discussion on that? What do you think is good about PPP? Why is the public sector wants to go in for a PPP? What else is the reason? What is the specific feature of a PPP? Why does the public sector want to go in for a PPP? I'm sorry?
Mobilization of fund you have already written, sir.
Yeah.
Then there would be easy AMC, annual maintenance contract. Maintenance of the equipment.
Why would you say that?
Because it would be the responsibility of the private sector to run the system more efficiently.
So you expect it to be more efficient.
More efficiently, so they would maintain the equipment more properly.
What else would be the reason for a PPP?
Sometimes for specialized jobs, you like to go to a person who has skills and ability to do that job.
Correct. That's part of efficient part.
Besides the financial.
Capitalizing on efficiency. What else is? And why would the project not complete on time? What is the risk? What is the problem there?
The person is putting in money, he would like to have the return as early as possible. He is owning it. When it's in the public sector, nobody owns it.
So we're saying that risk gets shared by the private sector. It's sharing of risks. Is that
Not necessarily sharing risks. The completion of the project.
timely completion?
Because they would like to earn money as quickly as possible, so operationally they would perform better. And if whatever input resource required, they would put in the money.
Correct. Sharing of risks. Risk transferring of risks. What kind of risks do you have in mind? Construction cost. What else? I mean, we sort of saw in case of Delhi's case also. What What was the risk in the case of Delhi Metro? Cost was one of them. Delay, yeah, timely delay, yes. What else was the risk? What about ridership? So essentially, PPPs, or feature of the PPP is exactly what you have said: scarcity of resources, efficiency, timely completion, transferring of risks, risk related to cost, risk related to ridership, risk related to delays. So these are very broad sort of parameters why one talks about a PP in a very broad context. Now let's take up the specific case of Yogyakarta Bus Terminal. The city issued a 30-year concession to a private company to build and operate an intercity bus terminal. Started very well, high returns, but for the past few years, the private sector, the private company which won the contract, is coming back to the city saying that we want to go back, we want to renege on the contract because the city has not met its part of the contractual commitment. And the city mayor actually doesn't know what to do. How could something which started so well could have gone so wrong? And what the mayor is doing now, he's engaged all of you as his advisors to advise him, one, how could he land up in this situation, such a well-designed project, and what is your advice to the mayor of Yogyakarta on what he should do? So before we get down to these things of why things went so wrong or what he should do, let's start first by asking the question, would you call this concession a success or a failure? What makes you think that this concession was a success, if at all, and what makes you think it was a failure?
It is a successful venture, and this is the reason why it earned profit for continuously 2 years beyond their expectations. But it is the failure of the government to protect it from the other competing terminus.
So we agree with that. Anything more to add to that? What about the infrastructure? How was it constructed? Terminal was constructed, but what about the terminal? Was it constructed on time? Was it constructed on cost? What were the parts of it? Why was it successful? Exactly. The terminal was constructed on time and below cost, almost 20% below the initially assessed cost. It was expected to cost 90 billion rupiah. It was built at 73 billion rupiah. So it's effectively 20% saving. What else would you call a success? What else would you call was a success of this project?
Actually, sir, it kind of helped people, facilitated them to use the bus in that part of the city.
Better
Better transportation service, a better terminal in southern part of the city, which was not earlier there.
It was supposed to provide, I think, 7 bus bays, and it, I think, provided for 13 bus bays. So it actually provided for more bus bays than was a part of the contract.
There was no need for the people to stay back in the hotels and those kind of facilities, actually not required.
So it
Actually, it was a failure.
was there
Was
that's a good
failure
point.
for the concessionaire, for the good for public.
Exactly. And you're both right, actually. So it was improved services for the passengers, but because it improved services for the passengers, they did not require to stay longer in the hotels or have or restaurant or have dinner. So that became a failure for the concessionaire,
But good for public.
but good for the public. I mean, exactly. So the improved services was in fact failure for concessionaire. What else would you see as the success of this project?
I think, sir, because of this terminal, many other also terminals came in that area. Although it's a failure as far as this is concerned, but for public, other bus depots also came up.
So it was not a case of failure of project. In fact, it was a case of failure of system in fact, regulatory system. Government has failed.
Did the government actually fail?
Yes, because they have failed in stopping this illegal terminal.
But they did close quite a few of the illegal terminals.
That
Did-
was not the responsibility of the customer.
I know, but no,
It
what
was
about,
the
yeah,
responsibility
correct.
of the
No, what-
government to allow him level playing field, and government has failed in that.
that is the ground on which the concessionaire is saying that I want to go back on my contractual obligations.
This thing was there when he has taken the contract because it was not a private bus terminal. See, it was a terminal of a government, other provincial government, although it is on the fringe of that particular province, near that. So while he was taking this contract, he was aware that this thing is going to happen. We can't say on that day.
We don't, from this case study, we don't know whether he knew that or he didn't know that. What we know is, what we know,
When you are making this
what we know, that's the reasons for the failure. Let's go to the reasons later on. Let's just look at the success and failure right now. I mean, yes, illegal terminals was part of the reason for the failure, but
It was good for public also.
but the government, as would say, the government was able to close a number of illegal terminals, and the one terminal they could not close was not a part of the contract, which was outside the boundary of the city, was a provincial terminal in the north, which was not part of the contractual obligation. So what else? I mean, what about as a part of the success? What about the return to the city, the profits to the city?
The revenue, the city cheaper
They were getting consistent profits.
from 100 million.
From 100 million to 300. So revenue for the first 2 years, city revenues went up. The city revenue went up from 100 million rupiah to 300 million rupiah. Let's look at the failure. Yes, competition from illegal, you're right, and improved service also meant that passengers didn't need to stay there as long, so there was a little bit of loss. What else would you see this as a failure?
The private buses tried to avoid this particular terminal and they were picking up the passengers outside the terminal.
So, what difference should it? Why do you think there was a failure?
Because this particular terminus was not getting the required fee. Though these illegal buses were picking up the passengers without paying their terminal fee.
Charges were higher.
From the roadside.
They were trucking outside.
Does everyone agree with that? I mean, was opening of illegal terminals?
So, sir, even without illegal opening terminal, the buses were picking up the passengers from outside the terminal.
From the street.
Yes.
So buses, correct. So this terminal was losing revenue.
Yes, sir.
Traffic enforcement.
Poor enforcement, yeah, poor. But that, I mean, there's a reason for the failure. But let's focus on what the failure was. Failure was it was reduced revenue. what else will you see as a failure of this concession?
It was supposed to be a growth center for the other part of the city,
Aha.
promoting commercial and other things. Whereas it provided only the bus terminal and the growth of the area was not.
It could not be used. It could not be used for the growth of the south part of the city.
The impact of the failure of the concessionaire will impact to the other investor want to participate to the PPP later in the infrastructure of this, to build the infrastructure of this.
Right.
I think about the impact of another concessionaire in
So it was impact on the infrastructure.
I think one fellow is the company cannot issue a contract commitment in phase 2. That means because the revenue not enough for them to recover, and they cannot contest the concession.
Okay. I mean, Mr. Fook, a very good point. But that's the reason for the failure. We'll come to the reasons later on. Let's just focus on what was the failure. Let's just focus on that. But you're right. But let's come to the reasons later on. Just looking at the failure.
It was a failure of trust on part of the government. Maybe future government.
Okay. No.
PPP
Okay. That's no.
question.
Okay. That's that's a separate part. Yeah, possibly. But what you're coming to what contributed to the failure, what the implication of the failure. But what specifically you would say is you would see this concessionaire, the whole concessionaire package as a failure. Yeah, okay, that's true. That's true. But again, that's separate part of the discussion. What about we talked. Sorry. Okay, failure of PP. Well, but PP.
Depends on number of issues which is beyond control of anybody.
Okay, we'll. Okay,
Another issue,
right.
the concessionaire has appointed a very big executive of this departmental store chain,
Right.
and he failed to bring the desired result to this company. That's why it also failed.
Okay.
He failed to
So the commercial centers which are supposed to be opened up in the south.
and especially he appointed a person of a big chain. He failed.
Commercial center never really took off.
It means it's a failure of business plan.
It's a failure of business plan.
I think the government also failed in they cannot control the illegal terminal.
Lack of control. Yeah, we say that competition from illegal terminals because they could not control it. Yes, you're right. You're right.
They cannot show their commitment.
What else? What were the other factors, both in the control of the public? Maybe there are some extraneous factors also, which resulted in the failure, which were beyond the control of anyone. The earthquake. It was the earthquake in 2006, because of which, for that 1 year, the demand for travel went down. What was there any other external factor which contributed to the failure? Low cost airline, exactly. So you had the earthquake.
Then development of low-cost airline.
Yes, Mr. Fogg. Yes.
Yes, I think one problem happened also at the same time, the low-cost airline development.
Low cost airline development. Okay.
Competition.
Correct. I mean, because of low cost airline, the demand for road traffic went down, which reduced the demand for buses, which reduced the profit of the terminal. So obviously that was seen as a failure.
I think you have mixed up the things. You said we talk about failure, and now we have gone into reasons for failure.
But the failure, just talking the failure, the external factor, what are the reasons for failure? What the failure? That earthquake was the failure, that profit went down. It was the reason for failure. No, you're right. It was the reason for failure. No, you're right. So,
Another is, sir, unfavorable conditions of the banks, say, to
okay.
finance the project.
Okay, that's okay. Well, good point. The bank. This is okay. So, purely from the concessionaire's point of view, from the PTPK, purely from the PTPK, who is the concessionaire, would you see this? Would the concessionaire see that as a success or a failure? Would the PTPK say failure? Why would he see this as a failure? Why would the PTPK see this as a failure?
Ultimately, the objective of CTP was not to spend money.
What was the return on his equity? I think table 2 gives you some idea about the return on equity. The exhibit 2 in the case, what was the return on equity for the concessionaire? What is the return on equity? Exhibit 2 gives you that number, the return on equity for the concessionaire. Sorry? Equity was 20 billion, and equity was 20 billion. So what was the return on his capital? Less than 1%. The return on equity capital for the PTPK was less than 1%. As a private sector, obviously he will see that as a failure.
And that when he has mortgaged the entire property to get
That's I mean, going beyond just the reasons for success and failure, PTPK is a construction company. It did the construction job very well. It constructed the terminal on time, 20% below the cost. PTPK is not a bus operating company. It is not a public sector bus company. It is not a commercial shopping center management company. And perhaps they knew that, and what they did was they engaged a high-level executive from Matahari on their team, hoping that by employing that professional on their team, they'll be able to induce the big commercial company to come in and open their branch there, which will lead to opening of other commercial centers. But that did not happen. So fundamentally, here was the case where you had a private sector selected through a process who knew nothing about the business except construction, which he did very well. Yes.
Can you look at it in another angle also, saying that they've invested money, now they just don't want to go for commercial center from PTPK point of view, and the money, actually the project is earning money, but the major share is going to the city government. So they can go for a hard bargain saying that we will not construct commercial center, you give us some share from your share,
No, but
the project becomes successful.
Would it become successful if because look, when the project was designed, the basic premise was that the commercial center will subsidize the bus terminal.
That is wrong.
So, I mean, there's expected that, in fact, everybody knew that bus terminal on its own will not be profitable, will not be self-sufficient, and the commercial center will be able to subsidize. And the expectation was that it lead to sort of a growth center in the south, which was a lagging area. I mean, all the population, all the university, all the activity was in the north. So the expectation was that by opening, the city's expectation was that by opening the terminal in the south, they'll actually be able to create some more economic activity, create a balancing power, more dynamism, more growth. That did not happen.
Actually, basically you make a lot of assumptions. And those assumptions are actually rosy pictures of that area.
Okay,
This is going
okay.
to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen.
Okay, and now,
And nothing happened.
okay, now, is it not the job of the private concessionaire who is putting up 20 billion rupiah to evaluate, to make an evaluation and say whether he I mean, look, somebody agreed to bid, to put his money on it. So should he not done that? And if he didn't do that, what else could he have done?
No, it is his job because he is putting a lot of money. He should have understood that this is going to happen this way.
And he was not a bus operator, and he's not a commercial center management company. He is just a construction company, and he did it very well. He had no idea how bus terminals operate. He had no idea about the commercial centers operate. He hired somebody from the successful commercial center, but he hired that somebody as an individual. He had no stakes in the game. The moment he saw that commercial center was not coming up, he left the job and went away. That individual lost nothing.
But this lack of experience, is it really necessary? Because in major companies,
Not necessary. Because suppose you are taking on a project.
Okay, that's okay. Go on, yeah.
Always one particular project would be first of its kind. There is a likely chances of that being repeated.
What would you have done if you had won the contract as a construction company, knowing that you don't have experience in bus management or commercial center operation? What would you have done?
One was joint venture along with it. Joint venture along with
No joint venture.
bus operating company. That would be more logical rather than doing it on our own.
Even, sir, on behalf of the government, when we asked for the PPK mode,
We got a public bus company.
We give a condition, they should have an experience of 2 of this.
Okay, you're right. I mean, you guys are in the public transport business. You know how the business goes. So, as you rightly say, what you would have done is, having won the contract, fairly prestigious contract, large interbus terminal, you would have started knowing that you only know how to construct, don't know how to manage a bus company. You would have set up a joint venture. And joint venture, Yogyakarta Bus Terminal Company, where PTPK would be the construction company. In return for some equity, it will get the right to construct the terminal. Then you have the commercial center, which is Matahari, let us say, which will put some equity here in return for managing the commercial center. And then you'll have a bus company here. In return for some equity, it gets the contract to actually operate that bus terminal. And that's what you would have done. You know you won the contract. You know about construction. You know nothing about operations. You know nothing about commercial center. You have set up a joint venture. And call people who have the expertise in this business. The basic message here is that the reason the public sector goes in for a PPP is it wants to draw upon the expertise of the private sector. The reason it failed was the expertise they were looking from the private sector. They didn't have that expertise.
So it was a failure on the part of the public sector also to get into deal with this kind of company.
Yeah, but there's a PTPK putting in 20 billion. I mean, somebody is putting 20 billion rupiah of his equity. So one presumes that as a city, I don't have the capacity to evaluate the project. That's the reason I invite the private sector. And I assume the private sector has the capacity to evaluate. Otherwise, they would not put their money into it.
But sir, maybe this condition would be desperate, but when we ask for the bidders, we expect that they have the 2-3 experiences of doing like this.
Aha. Now, okay. What was the evaluation criteria here for making the selection? What was the evaluation criteria?
Evaluation criteria was very liberal.
What was the evaluation criteria? Engineering and finance. Nothing else.
Which is the old civil works kind of
Precisely. So he had only the only two criteria in engineering: experience in engineering and finance. It didn't ask anything. The requirement specifications did not ask anything about how many years of experience you need to have to win this contract. X number of years of operating commercial center, bus operations.
He didn't ask also.
But that he asked also, how many of them would have participated?
We don't know. No, that's the second part. No, that's okay. That's it. Correct. That's the second part. But basically, the contract asked for expertise in engineering and finance, which was not whether you have experience in running this business at all. So the PTPK did very well what it was supposed to be doing, but then it failed. And because it failed, it is now going back to the city saying that you have not met your business, you have not met your contractual obligation. Sorry guys, I want my business value back.
But had they employed the experts in the beginning, they would have decided not to bid for the project because they would have realized that it's not a viable
Correct?
project.
Well, that I mean, it will.
Might have happened.
Okay, that might have. I mean, you're right. I mean, the basic that.
But then the onus also lies on the public sector to ensure that the proper DPR is prepared before bidding for the.
You're right. I mean, DPR is a very specific word used in an Indian context. It's a basic feasibility report. Besides the construction company, the PTPK, there is one other party which is involved, which should have been looking after its interest. Which is that other party? The bank.
He didn't do anything.
So what makes you say the bank didn't do anything? The bank lent 53 billion rupiah debt. And why, when the bank lent 53 billion rupiah of debt? So what makes you say the bank didn't do anything?
No monitoring of the project. When they give so much of fund to someone, they also kind of see the feasibility aspect.
Why in this particular case, why did the bank not look at the feasibility of the project?
Bank had a previous relationship.
Instead of forming a separate company, he lent it into PTPK, which was a very big company. So bank was not worried about that.
Right. So the bank had access to the entire balance sheet of PTPK.
Credibility of it.
So whether project failed or succeeded, the bank didn't really care. The bank had PTPK is one of the largest manufacturing firms in the city. If the project fails, how does the bank care? He'll get the money back because his money is hinged on the entire balance sheet of the firm, not the success or failure of this project. So the bank was under no obligation to do a in-depth feasibility analysis or the return or how viability of the project viability was never done by the bank.
They must have also examined the exit route available in the industry.
Well, the exit route was that I have access to your entire balance sheet. You are a big firm.
As per the BOT contract, the contractor has to return back the property to the government after 30 years.
Right.
Then on what basis the bank found it secure with its loan? That has to also serve in.
No, it was a 30-year loan, but in 30 years, the bank will get its money back. Bank-
failure, it doesn't get even the basics.
No.
Because
The bank-
property, whatever is built or constructed has been returned by the contractor to the government after 30 years.
You are right, but at the end of the day, the bank's liability or the bank risk was not in any way related to the success or failure of the bus terminal. Every month, for X number of years, the bank was supposed to get his cost of capital from the financial budget, from the balance sheet of the firm as a whole. So 30-year, 50-year, 20-year, I mean, there's a complete separation from the debt from the bank lending the money and the project succeeding or failing. The two issues are completely dealing. So bank had no incentive to do a thorough examination on how viable is the project. I mean, you go to buy a house, you go to set up a simple firm, you go to the bank for business, for borrowing money, and the bank will ask for a very, very detailed balance sheet, your return on the capital, what you've done, what is your equity. They'll ask you 101 questions. In this case, they didn't need to do that.
I think what the bank provided is it gave them a loan for
Yeah.
9 years at
Correct.
a very high interest rate of 14.5%,
Correct.
which is very different from the 30-year concession. What I can see from here, the government or the city authority is the first problem. They should have known that they are going into a BOT. They are going to construct this terminal for 2 years. But the longest period, which is 28 years when the operation will be taking place, is the one that is critical. And that is what is also going to happen, say, in our cities and countries. If you are going, say, for a BRT, you're going to construct it in 2-3 years. But it's going to operate for 15 years. What is very important is not building. Okay, building is important, but the operation over the next 15 years is very critical. If you get that correct, then you have got the whole concession correct.
You are absolutely correct. But as the public sector, I don't have the capacity to evaluate the merits or completely be responsible for the risk. That is the reason, and I don't have the money. It says up front that if the city did not have the money, the Ministry of Finance was reluctant to pass on the money to the city. I needed the bus terminal to be built because the congestion was getting high. So I did need to build the the terminal, went out for a PPP. I had my terms of the contract. Somebody came forward to give me the equity and the debt, and I gave the contract to that firm. And I presume that that firm which is bidding and putting the equity has the capacity. Yeah, please.
I think the public has a very, very important role to play in the success of this, because by default the public takes on certain risks, and it is the role of the public to weigh those risks and decide whether it is okay to go ahead with this concession. Now, because they didn't handle the risk of illegal terminals, even when they know that the private guy failed in so many different aspects, because they didn't really handle that risk very well and handle it and address it, they are stuck in a legal dilemma that this guy is using this as an excuse, but they can't really get out of it. So the public has a responsibility to weigh its own risks and actually weigh the risks of the private sector.
Let's talk a little more about it. The government had no equity, no stakes in this. All the risk, all the money, financial risk was being borne by PTPK. So what risk did the public have? What financial risk did the people have?
I think the interest of the public is in a successful project.
Okay, so
if the project fails at any point, even the public has failed.
Yeah, but ultimately public expects. Yeah. No, you're right. No, but that's why we call it a public service. So public people like you and me think that the government knows what they are doing, and they evaluated the relative merits of the game and made the right decision. As a public, my money is not at stake because the private sector is putting all the money. Sorry.
The municipal had a choice of getting an expert to prepare the bidding documents, which at that point they failed, because an expert could have foreseen what was needed in this contract. If that had happened,
Okay.
then maybe that could have been covered.
You're right about that. Yes.
Yeah, I think I was buying make the loan directly to the contractor, because here is also the public play the role. PPP public have to play some role here, but here that the bank make the loan directly to the contractor. That is a
I mean,
story between story between the bank and the
I think,
contractor. Is a common bidding. Here is a PPP different. That the public have to play.
no, I think we all agree that it was not a very well-designed contract. I guess the challenge now is, why was it badly designed? What could be done differently? And now that the concessionaire wants his way out, and is claiming that the government has to give the money back, all the business value back, what does the mayor do? I mean, that's the bottom line. So we are trying to analyze this. Now, let's step back for a moment. Why did the mayor have to borrow money from the private sector to construct this bus terminal? Why did he have to borrow money? Because as the case says, what was the rate of it? What was the interest rate if the money was borrowed by the Ministry of Finance? If that was the case.
14%.
Sorry, no. What was if the money was borrowed by the Ministry of Finance for constructing this terminal? What would have been the interest rate? 11% going down to 8%. It was about 8 to 11%. So public sector could potentially borrow, I mean, there were some constraints to it, but potentially he could borrow at the rate of 8 to 11% from the public sector. At what rate did the bank lend the money to PTPK?
14.5. 14.5.
And there was a 30% equity of the PTPK, and since there was an equity, his expected rate of return was surely much higher than the 14.5, at least higher than 15. So the weighted average cost of capital was at least more than 15%. So as a city, I could borrow the money at 8 to 11% from the government to construct the terminal, as opposed to now borrowing the money at this rate from the private sector. Why should the government do that in the first place?
I think it seems like
Is it a valid, two questions here. Is it a valid comparison?
it is a valid comparison, because the 8 to 11%, there seem to be a lot of difficulties in getting, well, in theory, they could get.
Let's assume that the money was available. Let's assume that difficulties didn't exist. Let's assume that this was not a city terminal, this was an international bus terminal, in which case the Ministry of Finance will not have an objection. Let's say the money was available and the Ministry of Finance did actually borrow the money to construct this.
But you are told the ministry was not comfortable with this point.
That's it. Yeah.
Any source.
I'm just, if it,
So that was difficult for the municipal to access any other loan from the
okay.
government.
If for a moment we assume that we are not talking about a city bus terminal, we are talking about an international bus terminal, in which case Ministry of Finance will not have an objection. If that was the case, would this comparison be still valid?
But ease of execution with the private loan was easy.
I mean, that's now just purely from a finance point of view. I mean, you're coming to a separate question now. Purely from a financial point of view, the city could borrow from 8 to 11%, but it decided to borrow at more than 15, 17, 18% from the private sector.
The local body, they have to take permission from the ministry, and the ministry was not willing to give the permission.
Yeah, I'm just saying that for a moment, if we assume for a moment that, I mean, the Ministry of Finance was becoming more open to the idea, as the case is. So if that permission was given and they could borrow, then what would you say? Is the comparison? Because in this case, if the project fails, the complete liability falls on the people, the taxpayers. In this case, if the project fails, the complete liability falls on the private sector. Public sector has no liability.
Because he is asking for arbitration, he wants his money back. He must be banking on some of the provisions of the concession agreement. That in case it fails, then this is the amount I'm going to get back. So in case, like Delhi Metro, he knows that even if it fails, I'll get this much of money. So in that case, if part of it also
Let's come. I mean, what you're talking about now. What do we recommend to the mayor? Let's come back to as the last stage. But there's nothing in the contract. There's nothing in the contract which said that the contract was there based on engineering and financial consideration. And there's only one criteria in the contract, which was X% of the profit should come back to the city, which the concessionaire was doing right. So,
if you go by this logic, then any PPP project would be costing more than what the government executes. The cost of that project would be from the sector. So it means the public sector is trying to pass on the liability to the private sector by increasing the PPP project.
the point that I'm trying to make here is exactly that. That if the public sector is looking to the private sector as a PPP just to borrow money, it is a bad reason. But if the public sector is looking to sharing risk, capitalizing on the efficiency of the private sector, then it may be worthwhile giving a higher interest rate to the private sector because the private sector will deliver the job that much more better. Now, there's a balance the public sector has to make. But purely, if money is the reason why the public sector wants to borrow, wants to go a PPP, it is very often a very bad reason. Unless the expectation is that you're looking for expertise which you as a public sector don't have. In which case, the higher cost of capital may actually be justified. I mean, like we see in this case, if the public sector was to construct this terminal on its own, it would have constructed this at 90 billion rupiah. Private sector actually saved you 20% by doing the job more efficiently. So even a higher rate of return was probably justified to give to the private sector to build this company. So the reason should never be trying to get access to money. The reason should be trying to get access to the efficiency of the private sector.
But then PPP mode should not be looking at the financial angle or only the expertise angle? Does it mean that?
Correct. PPP, if access to money is the only reason, then government can very often borrow at a lower interest rate from the market.
But here, suppose the project has gone well, the government would have got the bus terminal practically at no cost. They got zero cost. Only here they have given the land. The private PTPK has invested the money they have borrowed, and they will repay from out of their profit.
Correct.
And we will get back the profit.
No, but they're giving. No, the government is giving the government is giving first the land, which is about 9-10 billion rupiah. Secondly, the right for the private sector to operate that terminal for 30 years in exchange for a certain fee. So that is the right of the public sector. So
So in the conversion, it's between 0% and 8%. So there can be no loan which is at minus rate. So it will be always at plus rate. Whereas here we have the government has got the percent at 0%. So we should not go for PPP even in case of financial shortage. Financial reason could be one of the very well reasons for going for PPP. Not necessarily the expertise or efficiency of private sector.
sorry, I don't think I've.
For certain cases, government will have expertise than the private. For example, if there is a system of privatizing railways in some country, where there is no private player so far, government can first initiate it and have people without expertise, mainly for the purpose of financial investment.
But ultimately, the objective of the government is to provide better service at a lower cost in a competitive market, to pick up the best people to do the job, to do the best people to do a particular job. The constraint and the best, and that is where you get the higher return. You want the best people to do a certain job so that you can have a certain efficiency gain.
Better investment also, no? Whether investment is not a credit for PPP. I want to have a clarity on that. Let's see, for example, we are making flights, privatization of airport or air traffic. Then so far, if only government was running that, then there would not be a player from the market.
So, sorry, you are actually talking about a different form of PPP, which is a management contract, where the money actually is not involved, that you engage a private firm to manage an airport, manage a bus terminal. That's a different. Yeah, that's a different. I mean, PPP. I mean, PPP is not a single word really. There's a range. PPP has a broad range from a management contract to exclusive privatization, and there's a range in between. So yes, management contract where the government puts up its own money, but to ensure a better management of the airport or a terminal or bus operations, it engages the private sector. Yes, that is very often the case. Where money is not the issue. The government puts up its own money because it's a public building a road, for example. The government builds the road and then gives a 30-year concession to a contractor to maintain the road for the next 30 years. For example. Yes, there are lots of examples of that.
So can I put forth the solution?
So, sorry, we'll come to the solution now. Okay, let's. I mean, the basic issue here is that there is a bus company which has an equity. There's a PTPK which has certain equity, there's a commercial center which has an equity, and there's a bank here which has a debt. In return for equity and this debt, they get a right to operate the bus terminal, he gets the right to construct the facility, he gets the right to operate the commercial center. And if the commercial center, Mr. Matahari, if he actually had put in his equity for the commercial center, he may have told early on to the government that this is not viable. The demand is in the north. There's no demand in the south, and to expect and mind you, this is not a city bus terminal. This is an intercity bus terminal. If you're a city bus terminal, you could probably expect that to generate certain demand and certain activity. Intercity bus terminal where people come from different cities. So a good feasibility by the commercial company would have clearly told the government that this is not a viable project in the first place. But they were not hired in the first place. All that they were hired was a construction company. And they could never do the feasibility.
Nobody does a complete feasibility study. Because you see 11 participants, 11 people participated in the contract. We assume that nobody did that feasibility study. Out of all 11 of them, it's not possible. Everyone does it. But primarily,
The criteria.
Nobody does it. Otherwise, nobody does it. Everyone goes by the rosy picture for his
The criteria was your engineering experience and your financial return. That was the only criteria.
No, sir, because government wanted also free hand by the public. That's why they limited this.
Okay. Now, given this scenario, I mean, you are the advisors to the mayor. The question is, what should the city do? Two options: either they accept the claim or reject the claim. Or maybe you could propose something else. All right. Why do you say that?
Not accepting those claims,
We should continue with this.
nobody will do their due diligence before they take up the project. And because they will see that there's a precedence of, in case it fails, I can come out. And I get claim also. And this is what is the risk I have maximum.
Good. I mean, you're right. But the case also says that the city is on weak legal grounds. They go to the court and they lose. They lose. The city loses in the court.
This will
Then,
spoil the other one. In that case, this will spoil the image of the government, of the city council.
so what is the recommendation? Should the city accept it or reject it?
Initially, sir, it was expected that profit will be the 1 million, and it comes 3 times.
Right.
Now, if we see the chart, profit never goes down up to the expected ratio. Then how does it fail?
Sorry. So how does it? Sorry, I didn't get the last part. How is it failure?
How we arrive that it is failure?
It is a no. We talked about it. It is a failure because the concessionaire is getting 1% return on his capital. He is getting competition from illegal bus operations. Therefore, he's not getting the return he was expecting. Therefore, he goes to the city and says, I can't give you the profit which I was promised you, and I want my returns back. I'm withdrawing from the concession.
I'll not build it.
And he's built it. No, I will not build the. But then he also realized the commercial center is not viable. That's why the professional he engaged from Matahari company resigned and went back.
No, there's a question. So the 20%, he is taking 1% returns out of 30% he is making from the project.
No, he's got.
70% is going to.
Sorry. He's because that is a part of the contract.
That's what now the city should do is say that he give them some more money from that.
So you are saying so you are saying the city should renegotiate.
Yes.
So it's neither. So okay. So it's neither. Somebody said he should reject it, outright rejection. You are saying city should renegotiate.
My grounds, I can say one minute. The grounds for renegotiation is that fellow went with a heart saying that I should do something for the country. One. And another thing, he put entire company at stake with the bank, saying that I put my company to use. Forget about any venture, any joint venture, anything.
Right.
And even the mayor also said that I'll give you some more privileges in this. There's no solid contract. So the entire thing is more like a gentleman's agreement. It's not absolute foolproof contract. So might as well give him some renegotiation chances.
What does everybody else thinks?
Should say thank you, no, please go.
So what should the city do? Should it accept the offer and make the payment of 40 to 80 billion rupiah? Say that we are at fault, or fight it in the court, or renegotiate. And these are only 3 options which are there on the table. What are pros and cons of each?
I think the city can that means they can negotiation for the and 2 actions should be done. First, the government also control the illegal terminal, and secondly, the negotiation with the PDPT about the financial and the reorganization of the system, to ensure it's not efficient. If they reject, it's not the solution.
Okay. If they renegotiate the contract, what would you see as a disadvantage? Surely they renegotiate, city settles it with the PTPK, everybody is happy. Is that life good for everyone, or do you see a disadvantage in that?
Because in the previous contract, it's not clear about the duty and the responsibility between the public and the driver.
Right.
And they also cannot forecast the risk something happened. So now they will sit together for clarify what the government should do, what the PPTK should do, and analyze the situation.
Clarity of the contract. Okay.
PTPK is already poisoned in this contract, and they have tested and seen that maybe it's not viable for them. So they are looking for an exit strategy.
Okay.
The negotiation may be maybe getting into deeper problems for the municipality. I think the fairest is to find a way of settling the contract and start it afresh. But renegotiating at that stage may be dangerous for both parties.
Well, closing the contract means the city has to pay 40 to 80 billion business value.
We are told we could pay the present value.
Well, but still, which is lower, correct. But the challenge here is that the reason city sought the PPP, it had no money of its own. So in either case now, whether they settle lower value or higher value, the city will need some money to be able to settle this so that, and the city has no money.
The way this situation is unfolding, somebody has to get out more money, either the contractor or the municipal. At some point, money has to be spent by the municipal.
Now they can try
If you
for
look at
two
it,
sources.
if you go to what the party signed as a contract,
In case the renegotiation is successful, then the project goes on. If it's failure, then the government will have to repay the amount. Then they can go into government of federal government. Because now the loans are available and government is willing to give permission to that loan. Or they can rebid the contract. They can rebid.
Look. Let's. You're all right in some ways.
I'm going back to the initial contract which was signed. That cannot be defined as a PPP, because a PPP contract should cover all parties to that PPP agreement, which is the client, the concessionaire, which should not have been PPP, should have covered the contractors, the service providers, the financial, all should have been in that service agreement, so that each party should have optimized and not maximized. But in this case, you're seeing the PTPK, which was one of the only two parties in that concession agreement, wants to maximize. So they should go back to the drawing board.
Tell me a private sector which does not want to maximize its profit. I mean, what do others think about it? Is there a private sector who does not want to maximize its profit?
In a PPP contract, if you maximize, you will not go anywhere, because everybody looks for a loophole. Yet all the parties need to be able to satisfy.
Look, I mean, you're talking about an utopia, which is right. Everybody should be fair. But I think if you take a step back, the basic lesson from this case study, which sort of want to be highlighted, is that if the public sector is looking for money as a primary source, primary reason for going a PPP, it is very often a very bad reason. But if the public sector is looking for improvement in efficiency gains, transferring some risks, we saw in case of Delhi Metro, forecasting, demand forecasting. Public sector has no capacity to forecast demand. So he sort of, by going to PPP, he's transferring that risk to the private sector to be able to prepare good feasibility, to be able to forecast demand right, assuming that they know what they're doing. In this case, things went wrong, because while they gave a higher interest rate to the private sector, they're looking for money, higher interest rate, and the private sector firm they hired did not really have what they're looking for, which is competency in the job, other than construction, which they did very well.
That transfer of the risk is what is affecting the PPP contract. You should not transfer an entire obligation to another party. If this client had looked at the viability and came up with the full scenario of what was to be expected, then you don't expect surprises in the future. But if you transfer the full obligation to a concession,
you're right. No, you're right. Look, and also, most tempting, as you saw in this discussion around the table, is that renegotiate, reduce the amount of fee you are getting, increase the fee you're charging for buses or parking, renegotiate the contract. That's always most tempting, and most PPP concessions that I know in the transport sector end up as being renegotiated. But that's very often a very bad reason, sets up a very bad precedence. Yeah.
So I think in order to find a solution, better we should go to the ocean. That's why the public need this why?
Precisely. Why? Is correct. Is it money the reason? Right. You're right, Mr. Fogg. Is money the reason? Is efficiency the reason? Is transferring risk the reason? And so money is often a poor reason. Renegotiation is often a bad idea because that also always sets up bad precedents. Companies will always underbid, under-evaluate, undervalue, hoping that if things go wrong, they can always renege on their promise and ask for renegotiations. I mean, most road sector PPPs that I know, so many, end up as being renegotiated. And they set a bad precedent for the future. So what is the motivation for PPP? Why should the public sector go for PPP? Essentially, the basic reason is to capitalize on efficiency gains. So it is correct to pay, it is correct to pay a higher interest rate to the private sector in exchange for the efficiency gains, which will more than compensate for the higher cost of capital. And efficiency gains result from one simple reason, that you have an open and transparent bidding process. You engage firms who have the skills to do the job. That's what you're looking for. Then you also, as a part of that equation, you also need lenders who have some stakes in the game. In this case, the lender, the bank, had no stakes in the game. So he didn't really care. He did no evaluation. And because he was giving money, the public sector thought, well, the bank is giving money, they must be doing something right about this project, therefore we have no problem. But the bank thought that, well, I have access to the entire balance sheet, why the hell should I care? So one is, the lenders must have some stake in the game. Ultimately, if you're getting, whether it's the bus company or the construction company or the commercial center, unless you have some stakes in the game, you will not go through the process of due diligence. So it's important to have the lenders who have some stake in the game. And you will get the efficiencies gains the most if you provide the right incentives to everyone to maximize those gains. But money, just access to money, is very often a poor reason. This is sort of my closing comments. Any other sort of comment, suggestions?
Suppose the government has idle assets in the form of land. So instead of government itself investing money on building it, because the government has so many other priorities.
Correct.
So it can put it to some other use.
Absolutely.
And this idle land could be developed jointly with the private sector.
Correct.
So
Correct.
even lack of resources or financial angle also, PPP can be looked at. It's not necessarily that expertise only has to be paid. That's my submission.
No, that is what I'm saying is that access to capital should not be the only reason why we are looking for PPP. Yes, money is a reason. You go to private sector to get some more money, which you don't have today. I mean, I want to buy a house. I don't have the money to buy a house. What do? I go to the bank to borrow money in return for certain equity and certain risk that I take. So borrowing money will always be the case. But if I just borrow money for the sake of borrowing money, then I'm borrowing money at a much higher rate from the private sector as compared to borrowing money at a lower rate from the public sector. So there should be something to balance that higher interest rate as demanded by the private sector. That's all that I'm saying here. So yes, it is fine to borrow money.
But here we are not borrowing money from private sector. The private sector is borrowing money from somebody else.
As I'm concerned, as a public sector, I'm borrowing. I mean, it is the private sector which is borrowing money. Where he gets his money from is his business. I'm getting the money from PTPK. Now they go out to the bank, they go out to his brother, he go out to his father to borrow money. That's his business. But I'm getting the money from PTPK. So they do their own risk analysis. Sorry.
We have a feeling that
Sorry, one at a time. Yeah.
no, very often the feeling in government is that if we are not having money, just we will go for PPP mode. But you are saying that PPP mode should not look at the money angle, it should only give the expertise. That may not be every case, that's the protection. For example, if there is a privatization of rail, road or air or road, which was not involved in by the public earlier, then how it will materialize?
Privatization of rail, I think I know what you're talking about. Privatization of rail has a huge built-in assets from the public sector. So the huge public asset which already is capitalized in the form of existing rolling stock. And you look for the private sector, in that case the reason for privatization is that you are looking for, again, the same reason, efficiency gains, better management style.
No, it is not new, I am saying new rail route. It's not that the existing route should be used by the public.
No.
Good example of what you say, I agree with you. See, like in our case, in railways, we are going for elevated corridor, probably for financial reasons. We have the expertise to deliver it. Probably private sector does not have the expertise. Yes. Similarly, Airport Express. It was given only because of monetary considerations, not that private sector had better expertise.
That's why it failed. That's why it failed, and it came, and who won in that game? The private sector. Yes, you're partly right. Because you are only going for money to the private sector. You did not do your due diligence. Private sector didn't do the due diligence. After 2 years, they said renegotiate. Sorry, you take it back. And all the obligations, financial obligations, came back to the public sector.
No, that's okay. See, failure reason is okay. But primary reason for involving PPP partner, going for PPP was finance. See, failure can be with the government also, with the private party also. Failure is a different issue altogether. It was probably because the due diligence was not done even by the, even failure matter could have also failed.
Actually, this issue of content ratio is something related to...
Look,
No.
money, look, public, I think, if, all that I'm saying here is, if money is the only reason that we are going to the private sector, it is often cheaper for the government to borrow money because it has a higher, it has a much better rating. But I see what you're saying. The government goes out to borrow money. You have the expertise in you have really the expertise, but you are going to the private sector partly because you have the very highly specialized expertise. But what you don't have is the resources or the manpower to actually build it, the construction on time, day-to-day monitoring that you don't have. So sharing risk essentially. So you are going to the private sector essentially to pass on some of the risk to the private sector, while you have the most specialized on the engineering side, mechanical engineering. It is Ministry of Railways has that capacity. But in construction, in monitoring, in access, that's where you want to capitalize on the benefits of the private sector. If you have the money and you have the capital, you have the expertise.
No, we don't have the money.
If you don't.
Expertise, 90% of the time the private sector also borrows on the expertise of the railways. 90% of the people in life because the railways.
Yes, very often government has expertise than the public.
Efficiency is
Yes.
Ultimately, in a PPP, trying to get the efficiency gains and having the right incentives to perform your best is the most important thing. And if those incentives are there, and that transparency is there in the entire bidding process, you'll end up with a better product.
There is a recent communication we received, sir, from to our government regarding a big high-speed railway traffic in the west coast of Kerala, cutting across our region in there, at the rate of 18 lakh crore rupees on PPP mode, and they wanted acquisition and other things. So when we see the executive summary of the project, we would find only the reason is...
You are not hearing what you have said. You can't hear what you have said.
Look. I think I think I know what he's saying, and we can have this discussion. We can have the discussion separately. The issue here is that the government has got very fancy ideas about $1 billion project. They don't have the $1 billion, they go to but they have all the expertise. Because they don't have $1 billion, they go to the private sector to borrow that money. No, we can talk separately, but the merits, the feasibility of the project, the merits of the project, frankly, the viability of the project is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. For the government to think the only reason they're going to the private sector is money, and they have everything else, it's a well-prepared project, something that I think needs to be looked at a little more carefully. I don't know the details, so I can't say that.
In this case, all the due deliberation is done by the government only, whether it is profitable, not profitable, feasible, not feasible. And most of the time, private sector just takes it for the gospel truth, whatever is given to it. Because they probably do not have that.
No due diligence on their part.
They don't have that kind of expertise.
We can, okay. Mr. You're saying something.
Yeah, I have a very fundamental question. That's why the public and the private need the PPP. So that means we should clarify their benefit. Yeah. And I think we have three players: the public, the
Private.
and the bank.
Right.
So I think in the public, the government, they look the PPP as the one option, one solution for increase the budget, the money, because they don't have enough money to develop the infrastructure system. So they're looking the PPP as one kind of to invite the private to distribute the money and the budget in the system. So I think that is the private benefit from the public.
Right.
And the private, I think they need their activity, they need contract, they need the benefit when they do the business, so they enter PPP. I think that is the fundamental.
Yes.
But maybe we continue analyze. But I think in Vietnam, first of all, you know, now the government very want to develop the PPP. But the problem is legal framework not good enough.
That's other aspects of it. There needs to be legal framework, there needs to be transaction specialists, there needs to be the complete framework for a PPP to succeed. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. All right, thank you. Okay, yes.
About Indian perspective, since you are from there, how do you think whether the revenue sharing method of PPP, will it be feasible in the circumstances like in India?
I think it's a question of how the project is designed, how the feasibility is designed.
On principle, it's okay.
On principle, it is fine. Yes, I mean, in this case, it is perfectly fine. It's a question of, I mean, you can have a PPP. You can have the private sector participation even when the private sector is getting a subsidy from the government. Even that is called a PPP. That could be a PPP. I mean, it is. But you do the only advantage of private sector, like in bus operations, there could be privately sector operated buses, but the government gives a subsidy. And the reason and justification here would be that if the private sector operates, they'll be more efficient and they'll ask for a lower subsidy as compared to the same bus being operated by state-owned enterprise. So look, money.
Has it been proved successful, sir, so far?
Sorry, what?
Has it been proved successful so far?
Sorry, which one? Which issue?
The PPP board with the National Highway Authority of India.
So, sorry, I don't understand the question. What aspect of success?
National Highway Authority of India.
Yeah, I know National Highway Authority, but
PPP mode in that toll plaza.
Yeah, but now you want us to look at case by case basis, very specific case by case basis. But in general, PPP is that there is a competition. I mean, what we will not deny is that the need for competition, need for transparency, need for efficiency, need for having the skills in the job that you're doing. Those are very fundamental sort of elements of success of any project. Fundamentally. Yes.
In Kenya National Highways Authority, we are actively pursuing the PPP in investment of large infrastructure projects. And what we have done is to do benchmarking in countries that have successfully implemented PPP projects for $1 million projects. These are large infrastructure projects. For example, an expressway, which will cost about $200,000. And the message was very clear.
$2 million.
The message that we got was very clear, that all cards have to be on the table.
Right,
the card for the employer, the card for the financial, the card for the contractor,
Correct.
the card for the transaction advisors. All of them have to be on the table.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
in the concession agreement, all of them need to be part of the discussion and the solution that will come out. Because everybody should be aware of anything that will be made. The financial should be aware that this agreement has certain conditions that are involved in there. So that should things go wrong, everybody knows what was discussed initially. The negotiation midway becomes difficult, especially if it's a multi-million-dollar project. So the message is, as we
Transparency.
special purpose vehicle, all members should be
Transparency in deal making. I mean, that's actually right.
so that is why we are talking of minimum. But if any member of the concessionaire tries to modernize, as you say, then not everything will not go as planned.
All right. Thank you very much. We can continue this discussion over coffee, but thank you very much.